The morning sun cast long shadows across the flight deck of the aircraft carrier Akagi. As Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood motionless, his weathered hands gripping the bridge railing. It was June 4, 1942, and the Imperial, Japanese Navy's most formidable striking force, was sailing into what would become the most decisive naval battle of the Pacific War. For massive aircraft carriers Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu cut through the Pacific swells, their decks bristling with the finest naval aircraft the rising sun could muster. Nagumo's confidence should have been absolute. His carrier group had swept across the Pacific like an unstoppable typhoon, crushing Allied resistance from Pearl Harbor to the Indian Ocean. 250 aircraft under his command represented the cream of Japanese naval aviation, piloted by veterans whose skill was legendary throughout the Pacific. Yet something gnawed at the Admiral's consciousness, an indefinable sense that this operation felt different from their previous triumphs. The plan seemed straightforward enough. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's grand strategy called for a diversionary strike against the Aleutian Islands, while Nagumo's carriers would pulverize the American base at Midway Atoll, drawing out the remnants of the U.S. Pacific Fleet for a final, crushing blow. Intelligence suggested that the Americans possessed only 2 operational aircraft carriers in the entire Pacific, hardly a match for Japan's 4-carrier juggernaut. Commander Minoru Genda, the brilliant architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, moved among the flight crews with his characteristic intensity. His pilots trusted him implicitly, having followed his tactical genius through months of seemingly impossible victories. But even Genda felt the weight of expectation pressing down upon them. The Emperor himself had blessed this operation, and failure was simply unthinkable for the sons of Yamato. Captain Jisaku Okada of the carrier Kaga watched his maintenance crews preparing the Nakajima Kate torpedo bombers for the initial strike. These aircraft had dealt devastating blows to Allied shipping across the Pacific, and their pilots possessed an almost supernatural ability to deliver their deadly payloads with precision. The morning ritual of aircraft preparation continued with mechanical efficiency, each crew member performing his duties with the dedication that had made the Imperial Navy the terror of the Pacific. According to naval historian Samuel Eliot Morrison's comprehensive account in the Two-Ocean War, the Japanese possessed overwhelming numerical superiority in both aircraft and experienced pilots at this crucial moment in the Pacific campaign. Unknown to Nagumo and his staff, American codebreakers had been reading Japanese naval communications. For weeks, Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Fleet from his headquarters in Pearl Harbor, knew exactly where the Japanese carriers would appear and when they would strike. 3 American aircraft carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, were already moving into position northeast of Midway, preparing to spring the most audacious trap in naval history. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine the fate of the Pacific War. As Nagumo's carriers approached their launch point, neither he nor his officers could have imagined that they were sailing directly into the most perfectly orchestrated ambush in modern naval warfare. The rising sun's greatest naval striking force was about to face its moment of ultimate trial. At 4:30 in the morning on June 4, 1942, the flight decks of Nagumo's carriers erupted into controlled chaos as the first strike wave prepared for launch. 108 aircraft Aichi Valdive bombers, Nakajima Kate high-level bombers, and Mitsubishi Zero fighters thundered off the flight decks into the pre-dawn darkness. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, leading the strike from his Kate bomber, felt the familiar surge of confidence that had carried Japanese naval aviation to victory. After victory across the Pacific, the target lay 150 miles ahead, Midway Atoll, that tiny speck of coral and sand that served as America's westernmost outpost in the Pacific. Intelligence reports suggested minimal American air defenses, a handful of outdated fighters, and a few patrol bombers. For pilots who had devastated Pearl Harbor and swept the British from the Indian Ocean, Midway appeared to be merely another routine target. But as Tomonaga's formation approached the atoll, the morning sky suddenly filled with American fighters. Marine Captain John Smith, leading Fighting Squadron 21 in his obsolete Grumman Wildcat, threw his squadron directly into the path of the incoming Japanese bombers. The Marines knew their aircraft were outclassed by the legendary Zeros, but they also knew that every minute they could delay the Japanese attack might prove crucial. The aerial battle that erupted over Midway was fierce but brief. The Zero fighters, piloted by veterans of countless Pacific battles, systematically shot down 20 of the 26 American fighters that rose to meet them. Captain Smith himself fell to the guns of Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's greatest aces, but not before his Marines had disrupted the carefully planned Japanese attack formation. Despite the fierce American resistance, Tomonaga's bombers pressed home their attack with the precision that had become their trademark. Explosions rippled across Midway's installations as high-explosive bombs found their targets. The fuel storage tanks erupted in towering columns of black smoke, and the seaplane hangars collapsed under the weight of concentrated bombing. Yet as Tomonaga circled the atoll to assess the damage, he realized with growing concern that his single strike had not achieved the complete destruction his orders demanded. The American airfield remained operational through the smoke and flames. He could see aircraft still moving on the runway, and the defensive positions around the island's perimeter appeared largely intact. Most critically, the anti-aircraft guns that had savaged his formation during the attack were still firing defiantly into the morning sky. At 7 o'clock, Tomonaga's radio crackled with the message that would alter the course of the Pacific. "War, there is need for a second attack wave." The transmission, received aboard the flagship Akagi, sent a ripple of concern through Nagumo's staff. A second attack meant rearming and refueling aircraft, a process that would require at least an hour of intensive deck operations, during which the carriers would be completely vulnerable to counterattack. Commander Genda immediately grasped the tactical implications. The carriers' hangars were currently filled with aircraft armed with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes, weapons intended for use against American warships. That intelligence promised would appear later in the day. Converting these aircraft for a second land attack mission would require removing their anti-ship weapons and replacing them with high-explosive bombs, a time-consuming process that would leave the strike force exposed and defenseless. As Nagumo weighed his options, American patrol planes were already radiating contact reports back to Admiral Nimitz's headquarters. The Japanese carriers had been located, their position fixed, and their vulnerability assessed. 3 American aircraft carriers, hidden beyond the northern horizon, began launching their own strike aircraft in what would become the most desperate gamble in American naval history. Aboard the aircraft carrier Enterprise, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey gripped the control stick of his Douglas Dauntless dive bomber. As his engine roared to life in the pre-dawn darkness, it was 6:30 in the morning, and Task Force 16, under the command of Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, was preparing to launch every available aircraft in a desperate all-out attack against the Japanese carrier force. McCluskey, leading Air Group 6, understood that this single strike represented America's last hope in the Pacific. The American plan was audacious in its simplicity and terrifying in its risk. Admiral Nimitz had committed virtually every operational aircraft in the Pacific to this single battle, leaving the Hawaiian Islands defended by little more than hope and determination. If the attack failed, the path to the American West Coast would lie open to Japanese conquest from the carrier Hornet. Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle's former squadron mate, Commander Stanipring, led his air group into the morning sky. The irony was not lost on the American pilots. Many of them were the same aviators who had participated in Doolittle's daring raid on Tokyo just 2 months earlier. Now they found themselves facing the very carriers that had launched the Pearl Harbor attack, with the fate of their nation hanging in the balance. The 3rd American carrier, Yorktown, should not have been at this battle at all. Severely damaged during the Battle of the Coral Sea just 1 month earlier, she had limped back to Pearl Harbor with a massive hole in her flight deck, and her hull plates buckled from bomb damage. Navy engineers had estimated that repairs would require 3 months in dry dock, but Admiral Nimitz had given them 72 hours. Working around the clock, civilian contractors and Navy personnel had performed what could only be called a miracle of engineering, patching the great ship together with steel plates, wooden beams, and sheer determination. Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie, leading Yorktown's dive bombers, felt the weight of history pressing down upon his shoulders. As his Dauntless climbed toward the rendezvous point, these pilots knew they were outnumbered and outgunned, flying aircraft that were inferior to their Japanese counterparts in almost every measurable way. Yet they also knew that this moment represented the turning point of the Pacific War succeed, and America would begin its march toward victory. Fail, and the rising sun would dominate the Pacific for generations to come. As reported in Walter Lord's definitive account Incredible Victory, the American strike force that rose from the three carriers represented the largest concentration of naval aviation the United States had ever assembled in a single operation. The American formation faced immediate challenges that threatened to doom the mission. Before it began, communication failures scattered the various squadrons across hundreds of square miles of empty ocean, and navigation errors sent entire air groups searching for targets that seemed to have vanished. Into the vastness of the Pacific, Commander Ring's Hornet Air Group flew for hours without finding the Japanese carriers, eventually running so low on fuel that most aircraft were forced to return to base without ever engaging the enemy. But McCluskey's Enterprise Group, through a combination of skill and extraordinary luck, maintained course toward the last known position of the Japanese carriers. As his formation droned northward through the morning sky, McCluskey made a crucial decision that would alter the course of world history. Instead of turning back when he failed to find the enemy at the expected coordinates, he continued searching, following his instincts and the faint wake of a Japanese destroyer racing northward toward its parent fleet. At 10:22 in the morning, McCluskey's persistence was rewarded with the most beautiful sight any American pilot had ever witnessed. For Japanese aircraft carriers, their flight decks crowded with aircraft, steaming in perfect formation across the brilliant blue Pacific. The trap was about to be sprung. At precisely 10:24 in the morning, the course of the Pacific War turned on a single moment of devastating clarity. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading 37 Douglas Dauntless dive bombers from the Enterprise, gazed down at a sight that filled his heart with fierce joy. The entire Japanese carrier striking force spread below him like toys on a blue carpet, their flight decks crowded with aircraft in various stages of preparation. Aboard the flagship Akagi, Vice Admiral Nagumo faced the most crucial decision of his distinguished career. His flight decks were chaos, incarnate aircraft being rearmed, refueled, and repositioned in preparation for the second strike against Midway. Torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs lay scattered across the hangars, having been removed from aircraft, now being loaded with high-explosive bombs for the land attack. At this critical moment, when his carriers were most vulnerable, American dive bombers appeared like avenging angels in the clear morning sky. Commander Genda shouted orders across Akagi's flight deck, desperately trying to launch the Zero fighters that represented their only defense against the diving Americans. But the carriers' decks were so cluttered with aircraft and ordnance that launching fighters would require precious minutes they simply did not possess. The Japanese had been caught in the worst possible tactical position, unable to defend themselves and unable to strike back. McCluskey's voice crackled over the radio as he ordered his dive bombers into their attack. Attack! Attack! The Dauntless bombers rolled into their 70-degree dives, their crews pressed back into their seats by the tremendous G-forces. As they plummeted toward their targets at terminal velocity, each pilot selected his target with methodical precision. Akagi, the flagship of Japanese naval aviation Kaga, the converted battleship that had terrorized the Pacific. Soryu, the newest and most advanced carrier in the Imperial Navy, Lieutenant Dick Best, leading the second section of Enterprise bombers, made a split-second decision that demonstrated the tactical brilliance that would make him a legend. Seeing that McCluskey's group was concentrating on the Akagi, Best led his 3 aircraft against the Akagi while ordering the remainder of his squadron to attack the undefended Akagi. This decision ensured that 2 Japanese carriers would be struck simultaneously, preventing either from mounting an effective defense. The first 1,000-pound bomb struck Akagi's flight deck at 10:26, penetrating to the hangar deck where it detonated among the rearming aircraft, The explosion was catastrophic aviation. Fuel ignited in towering sheets of flame. Torpedoes exploded in chain reactions, and the carrier's structure buckled under the tremendous internal forces. Within minutes, Akagi was transformed from the pride of the Imperial Navy into a blazing funeral pyre. Kaga suffered an even worse fate. 3 direct hits in rapid succession turned the massive carrier into an inferno that could be seen from 50 miles away. Captain Jisaku Okada, the ship's commanding officer, remained on his bridge as flames engulfed his vessel, calmly directing damage control efforts even as the flight deck beneath his feet began to buckle and collapse. According to Gordon Prange's exhaustive research documented in Miracle at Midway, the coordinated American dive bomber attack achieved a level of tactical surprise and concentrated destruction that naval experts had previously believed impossible. At virtually the same moment, Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie's Yorktown dive bombers rolled into their attack on the carrier Soryu. Leslie's own aircraft had suffered a mechanical failure that prevented him from releasing his bomb, but his squadron mates pressed home their attack with deadly precision. Soryu, caught with her flight deck packed with aircraft being prepared for launch, erupted in explosions that shattered her hull and sent debris flying hundreds of feet into the air. In the space of 6 minutes, the Imperial Japanese Navy lost 3 of its 4 aircraft carriers, and with them, the cream of Japanese naval aviation. Hundreds of irreplaceable pilots and aircrew perished in the flames, representing years of training and experience that could never be replaced. The rising sun's dream of Pacific dominance died in those terrible minutes of fire and destruction. But the battle was far from over. Hiryu, the sole surviving Japanese carrier, remained operational and dangerous, her captain determined to extract revenge for the devastation of his companion ships. Captain Tomio Kaku stood on the bridge of the aircraft carrier Hiryu, the sole survivor of Japan's mighty carrier striking force, and watched the funeral pyres of his companion ships stain the Pacific horizon with columns of black smoke. Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, the 3 carriers that had spearheaded Japan's conquest of the Pacific, were burning. Wrecks, their flight decks twisted metal, their hangars infernos of exploding ordnance and aviation fuel. But Kaku was not a man to despair, and Hiryu still possessed the means to strike back. Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi, Hiryu's senior pilot, approached his captain with grim determination. 18 Ichival dive bombers and 6 Zero fighters remained operational, a pitiful remnant compared to the massive formations that had dominated Pacific skies for 6 months, but still capable of delivering a devastating blow if properly directed. Intelligence reports indicated that at least 1 American carrier lay within striking distance, and Kobayashi's pilots burned with the desire for revenge. At 10:45 in the morning, Hiryu launched her first retaliatory strike. Kobayashi led his formation eastward, following the retreating American dive bombers back toward their source. The Japanese pilots flew with the desperate courage of men who understood that their empire's fate hung in the balance. Each aircraft carried not just bombs and bullets, but the hopes of a nation that had never known defeat in modern warfare. The target they sought was the aircraft carrier Yorktown, the ship that should not have been in this battle at all. Rear Admiral Frank Fletcher, commanding Task Force 17 from Yorktown's bridge, watched his radar screens track the incoming Japanese formation with professional interest. The hastily repaired carrier had already performed beyond all reasonable expectations, simply by reaching the battle area. But now she would face the ultimate test of American damage control and fighting spirit. Lieutenant Commander Jimmy Thatch, leading Yorktown's fighter squadron in his Grumman Wildcat, intercepted Kobayashi's formation 30 miles from the carrier. Thatch had developed revolutionary new fighter tactics, specifically designed to counter the superior performance of the Zero fighter, and now he had the chance to test his theories. In the crucible of combat, the Thatchweave, as his defensive maneuver would later be known, allowed his slower Wildcats to present mutually supporting fields of fire that neutralized the Zero's advantages in speed and maneuverability. The air battle that erupted was fierce and decisive. Thatch's fighters, supported by anti-aircraft fire from the entire task force, shot down most of the attacking Japanese aircraft before they could reach their target. But Kobayashi, flying with the skill that had made Japanese naval aviation legendary, managed to penetrate the American defenses with 3 of his dive bombers. The first bomb struck Yorktown's flight deck at 12:10, penetrating to the 4th deck before exploding and starting serious fires throughout the ship's interior. The second bomb hit near the island's superstructure, killing or wounding dozens of men and disrupting the carrier's communications. The third bomb punched through the flight deck near the forward elevator, causing massive structural damage and flooding in the forward compartments. As documented in Robert Leckey's comprehensive Pacific War history, The Wars of America, Yorktown's damage control teams performed with extraordinary skill and courage, containing the fires and flooding that should have sunk the great ship within minutes. Commander Clarence Aldrich, Yorktown's damage control officer, led his teams through smoke-filled compartments and blazing passageways with the calm efficiency that exemplified American naval professionalism. Within an hour, his men had extinguished the fires, sealed the flooding compartments, and restored enough power to resume flight operations. By 1:30 in the afternoon, aircraft were once again landing on Yorktown's patched flight deck. But Hiryu was not finished. Captain Kaku ordered a second strike, this time led by Lieutenant Toshio Hashimoto with 10 Kate torpedo bombers and 6 Zero fighters. These pilots represented the absolute elite of Japanese naval aviation men who had perfected the art of torpedo attack during months of combat across the Pacific. If anyone could deliver a death blow to the wounded American carrier, it would be Hashimoto and his squadron mates. The second Japanese attack achieved complete tactical surprise, approaching Yorktown from the southwest while American attention focused on recovering aircraft from the morning's strikes. At 2:45 in the afternoon, Hashimoto's torpedo bombers swept in low over the water, their deadly fish running true toward Yorktown's port side. 2 torpedoes found their mark, exploding against the carrier's hull with tremendous force and causing catastrophic flooding that brought the great ship to a dead stop in the water. Yorktown began listing heavily to port as thousands of tons of seawater poured through the torpedo holes. Admiral Fletcher, recognizing that his flagship was mortally wounded, transferred his flag to the heavy cruiser Astoria and continued directing the battle. The carrier that had steamed halfway across the Pacific to spring the trap at Midway was dying, but her sacrifice had helped achieve the greatest American naval victory in history. The sun reached its zenith over the Pacific battlefield as Admiral Raymond Spruance aboard the Enterprise faced the most critical decision of his naval career. 3 Japanese aircraft carriers lay burning on the horizon, but the 4th Hiryu remained operational and dangerous, having just delivered 2 devastating attacks against the Yorktown. Every instinct of naval warfare demanded immediate retaliation, but Spruance's remaining aircraft were scattered across hundreds of miles of ocean, low on fuel, and desperately in need of rearming. Lieutenant Clarence Wade McCluskey, hero of the morning's devastating attack, approached his admiral with urgent intelligence. Search aircraft had located Hiryu approximately 100 miles to the northwest, steaming at high speed and preparing what appeared to be another strike against the American carriers. The Japanese ship was alone and vulnerable, but she still possessed enough aircraft to inflict serious damage if allowed to mount another attack. At 2:45 in the afternoon, Enterprise began launching every available aircraft for what would become the final act of the Battle of Midway. Lieutenant Earl Gallagher led 14 Dauntless dive bombers into the afternoon sky, followed by Lieutenant DeWitt Shumway's torpedo squadron from the Yorktown pilots, who had transferred to Enterprise after their own ship was crippled. These men carried the weight of American hopes as they climbed toward their rendezvous with the last operational Japanese aircraft carrier. Aboard Hiryu, Captain Tomio Kaku watched his damage control teams work frantically to prepare his remaining aircraft for one final strike. Lieutenant Commander Takashi Jigusa, Japan's most experienced dive bomber leader, supervised the arming of the last operational Val bombers with the meticulous care that had made him legendary throughout the Imperial Navy. But Jigusa's weathered face showed the strain of watching his air group decimated throughout the long day of battle. The irony of the situation was not lost on either commander. Hiryu had been designed as the ultimate expression of Japanese naval aviation, her aircraft, and pilots representing years of intensive training and combat experience. That had made the Imperial Navy master of the Pacific. Now she stood alone against the concentrated fury of 3 American carrier air groups, her survival dependent on the skill of her remaining aviators and the prayers of her crew. At 4:17 in the afternoon, Gallagher's dive bombers appeared, over Hiryu like harbingers of doom. The Japanese carrier attempted to evade the attack through radical maneuvering, her captain ordering emergency turns that sent green water cascading across her flight deck. But Gallagher's pilots had learned their trade in the morning's successful attacks, and they pressed home their assault with professional precision that left no room for escape. The first bomb struck Hiryu's forward flight deck, penetrating to the hangar level where it detonated among the aircraft being prepared for launch. The explosion was spectacular aviation fuel ignited in sheets of flame that raced throughout the ship's interior, while ordnance cooked off in chain reactions that shook the carrier's hull. Like a child's toy, a second bomb hit near the island superstructure, starting fires that quickly spread to the bridge and command centers. According to naval historian Samuel Eliot Morrison's detailed analysis, in History of United States Naval Operations in World War II, the attack on Hiryu demonstrated the evolution of American naval aviation, from the desperate improvisation of Pearl Harbor to the professional competence that would dominate the Pacific War. Captain Kaku remained on his bridge as flames engulfed his ship, calmly directing damage control efforts even as the temperature around him rose beyond human endurance. His executive officer begged him to abandon ship, but Kaku refused to leave his post while any hope remained of saving Hiryu. The captain's devotion to duty exemplified the warrior spirit that had made the Imperial Navy a formidable opponent, even in the face of inevitable defeat. By 6 o'clock in the evening, Hiryu was a blazing wreck, her flight deck buckled and twisted, her hangars exploding with stored ordnance. The last of Japan's Pearl Harbor carriers was dying, taking with her the dreams of Pacific conquest that had driven the empire toward this fateful confrontation. Admiral Nagumo, rescued from the burning Akagi, watched from a destroyer's bridge as his career and his nation's naval supremacy disappeared in columns of smoke and flame. The Battle of Midway was over, but its consequences would reshape the Pacific. Warren determined the fate of nations. As darkness fell over the Pacific on June 4, 1942, Admiral Chester Nimitz received the radio message that would transform the course of World War II. The Japanese fleet is in retreat, for enemy aircraft carriers destroyed. The greatest naval victory in American history had been achieved through a combination of code-breaking intelligence, tactical surprise, and the extraordinary courage of American naval aviators, who had faced overwhelming odds with unflinching determination. The statistics of destruction were staggering in their completeness. Japan had lost for aircraft carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, along with 1 heavy cruiser, 248 aircraft, and more than 3,000 officers and men. Among the casualties were some of Japan's most experienced pilots, including veterans of Pearl Harbor whose skills could never be replaced in a war of industrial attrition. The cream of Japanese naval aviation had perished in the flames over Midway, leaving the Imperial Navy with carriers but few qualified pilots to man them. American losses, while significant, were manageable in the context of total war. The carrier, Yorktown, despite heroic damage control efforts, finally succumbed to her wounds when torpedoed by a Japanese submarine 2 days after the battle. The destroyer Hammond, alongside assisting in salvage operations, was also sunk by the same submarine attack. 147 American aircraft were lost, along with 307 officers and men, a heavy price, but one that America's industrial capacity could absorb and replace. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, rescued from his burning flagship Akagi, faced the most difficult moment of his distinguished career. As he composed his report to Admiral Yamamoto and the Imperial Naval General Staff, the man who had led the Pearl Harbor attack who had swept British naval power from the Indian Ocean, now had to explain how Japan's most powerful naval striking force had been destroyed in a single morning by an enemy the Japanese had consistently underestimated. The broader strategic implications of Midway extended far beyond the immediate tactical results. Japan's offensive capability in the Pacific had been broken beyond repair, forcing the empire into a defensive posture from which it would never recover. The planned invasion of Hawaii was cancelled, the advance toward Australia was halted, and Japanese forces found themselves fighting to retain territories they had conquered. During the early months of the war, according to Walter Lord's comprehensive account, incredible victory, the Battle of Midway represented the precise moment when American industrial and technological superiority began to assert itself over Japanese tactical excellence and fighting spirit. Admiral Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack and Japan's greatest naval strategist, understood immediately that Midway represented a fundamental shift in the balance of Pacific power. The combined fleet commander had gambled Japan's naval supremacy on a single decisive battle, and that gamble had failed catastrophically. From this point forward, Japan would fight a war of attrition against an enemy whose industrial capacity dwarfed that of the island empire. The heroes of Midway became legends of American naval aviation. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, whose navigation and leadership had made the victory possible, received the Navy Cross and promotion to commander. Lieutenant Dick Best, who had led the decisive attack against Akagi, was honored for his tactical brilliance despite being forced to retire from active duty due to health problems caused by faulty oxygen equipment. Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie, whose Yorktown dive bombers had destroyed Soryu, continued serving with distinction throughout the Pacific War. For the pilots who survived Midway, the battle represented a transformation of American naval aviation from a force struggling for respectability into the dominant power in Pacific skies. The lessons learned over the waters near Midway, the importance of coordinated attacks, the value of dive bombing against naval targets, the necessity of fighter escort would be applied in dozens of subsequent battles as American forces began their island-hopping campaign toward the Japanese home islands. The Pacific War would continue for more than 3 years after Midway, with countless battles yet to be fought and thousands of lives yet to be lost, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. On June 4, 1942, in the space of 6 devastating minutes, American dive bombers had turned the tide of the Pacific War and ensured that freedom, rather than tyranny, would prevail in the world's largest ocean. The rising sun had reached its zenith at Midway. From this point forward, it would only set.